Welcome to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown, a look behind the curtain of global finance and monetary control with one of the foremost experts in the field. Author of the bestseller Web of Debt and the Public Bank Solution, Ellen Brown's groundbreaking work began the movement to create new American public banks. We'll look at issues surrounding the world of money and the systems and powers that control it, as well as the progress being made on the public banking frontier. The program is underwritten by Public Banking Associates, a national consultancy of experts advising government leaders pursuing creation of their own public banks at publicbankingassociates.com.
I think that China and the United States have very, very different economic civilizations, so to speak. China is based on state capitalism rather than private capitalism, and the Chinese couldn't change their system to become harmless to our economy, even if they wanted to.
Trade between nations is a primary component of international relations, and it's used to both encourage and or punish partners. China's outsized influence on American commerce in terms of both consumption and production has resulted in a lopsided imbalance between our nations that President Trump thinks he can correct. But so far, that objective has been elusive, and it looks like it's only going to be getting worse, with Trump attempting to order a complete shutdown of trade with China by our manufacturers. He says trade wars are easy, but it would appear that he's taken us to a new brink of economic endangerment. Today, Ellen talks with one of our country's top experts in trade, Ian Fletcher. So, hello, and welcome once again to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. I'm Walt McCree, Senior Advisor to the Public Banking Institute. We're just off a vacation period that has seen a number of important developments in international relations, but also on the public banking horizon, as new developments in California are bringing a hopeful prospect for moving the idea of municipal public banks forward in that state. We think it could set a new national benchmark. We'll discuss all that in a moment with Ellen. Now, as you may recall, this summer also marked the 100th anniversary of continental America's only public bank, the Bank of North Dakota. We've been dipping into its history in recent segments, and today we'll hear another report from the bank's official historian and author, Mike Jacobs. This time, we'll look at how the oil component has played into the bank's operations and profits. The folks in North Dakota are proud of their unicorn bank institution, and they've been sharing its rich history and remarkable capabilities. So we hope you'll stay with us to listen to Mike Jacobs later in this show. And Ellen continues to stir things up in the press with wide-ranging discussions about monetary issues through her articles. Most recently, one that focused on how a solution to our economic woes found its original form 5,000 years ago. That and other developments are on our list for today's show.
So, Ellen, public banking has had some interesting landmark developments this summer. One was the 100th anniversary of the Bank of North Dakota, which was celebrated at the end of July. But there is another new development, which we think has some significance, in California. Let's start talking about a number of things, including that, to update people on what's developing in public banking.
Okay. Well, AB 857 was a bill brought by the California Public Banking Alliance, which is an alliance of advocates from 8 different cities in California. We've been working at this project of trying to get state-owned banks and city-owned banks established for close to a decade, and we keep running up against the same obstacles, many of which they shouldn't actually apply to a public bank. For example, FDIC insurance only covers $250,000. If your sole depositor is going to be a city with millions or billions of dollars, then or a state with billions of dollars, then FDIC insurance isn't going to go very far. So you've got to have some other way to protect your deposits, that type of thing. So there are all these rules that need to be relaxed in order to facilitate setting up public banks. So AB 857 is an effort to do that, and it has now passed both houses of the California legislature, or all the committees in both houses. Now it's at the stage where it has to go back to the floor because certain amendments were made as they went along, and then it has to go to the governor. But we're very optimistic because Gavin Newsom, the governor, did express his wholehearted support for public banking when he was a candidate for governor. So hopefully we'll get this bill passed and proceed from there. We'll be able to make it easier to bring bills.
And there are a number of cities in California that seem to be lining up to get a bank charter.
Right.
We have about
so that's all very exciting. They're waiting for the results of that bill.
So that'll facilitate and create some sort of a national landmark or benchmark, which hopefully will encourage other legislators around the country to be able to consider those changes that need to be made in their own banking law so that their cities and towns can also take that on.
Yeah, it is said that the other states look to California. California tend to be the creative. Fools jump in. We're the ones that jump in first.
Well, there's so much to take care of, and relative to the money that's going to be needed. Of course, California confronted with a bunch of calamities in the form of fires, but then we have Florida calamities with water, and we have other calamities having to do with droughts and other things that are happening around us. Where's the money that's going to be needed to take on some of these other issues? Mm-hmm. Public banks would be in a unique position to do that, because we would be creating our own credit.
Right. So the advantages of a public bank are that you cut out the middlemen, so you can make below-market loans and return the profits to the city or to the local or the state, the local economy. You can determine where the money goes. It's not going abroad somewhere. And a bank, actually, we now know banks are not merely intermediaries taking in deposits and lending them out again. They actually create money when they make loans. And so if you have your own bank, you are creating new money for your local community instead of sending that potential off to Wall Street, which then creates new money for the financialized economy. You're actually creating new money that you can put into the productive economy, your local economy.
In creating our credit, in having our own bank and being able to create credit, people think that they're limited by the amount of the available cash that they have on hand. They don't understand, as you were suggesting, that they can actually generate this credit out of their own equity, and that our cities and counties have lots of equity, but they have no way of monetizing it.
Right, and California, for example, is actually very productive, and I mean the businesses are doing well. So there's a lot of money in California. It's just a question of mobilizing it. We want to turn that money inward toward our own local businesses.
You wrote an article titled "The Key to a Sustainable Economy is 5,000 Years Old," and it was a very powerful sort of an insight into what our circumstances are, and it's now being spoken to on the campaign trail by people like Bernie Sanders, who's talking about forgiving medical debt and forgiving student debt. Michael Hudson, the economist that you quote, and a friend of the show here, wrote a book called "And Forgive Them Their Debts." Tell us a little bit about how that debt forgiveness plays out.
Yeah, well, what Michael Hudson was writing about was the Mesopotamian system of 5,000 years ago. It lasted for 2,000 years, even though they had quite high interest rates. But the way we have lower interest rates, and yet we go through booms and busts. Inevitably, you have debt reaches peak debt, and then this economy can no longer sustain it. Because money is created as a debt and the interest is not created in the original loan, and the interest doesn't come back into the local economy. It tends to go abroad or into maybe more loans like capital, which then becomes more loans. In other words, so the debt always builds up faster than the ability to pay it off until eventually the system topples, and then the banks foreclose on the collateral, the people are turned out of their homes, the hedge funds like BlackRock, Blackstone, and Blackwater, they snatch up the properties at bargain basement prices, and then they rent them back to the former owners, alleged owners, at rents that nobody can afford. That's one reason we have a big homeless problem here in California, even though we have lots of rich people and lots of very poor people. I saw different people have been railing about the homeless problem in San Francisco and pointing to this allegedly socialist government and that they can't take care of this homeless problem, but nobody's pointing to what causes homeless problem. Those people cannot afford the rents in San Francisco. It's like $4,000 for a one-bedroom apartment. And these are the same people that used to thought they owned their own homes. They were suckered into the subprime debacle. That's our system. But the way the ancients did it was because the debts were actually owed to the temple or owed to the king, they could forgive the debts periodically. So they had periodic debt jubilees, like whenever they changed kings or they had some military victory or something, they'd do a debt jubilee. Because, as Michael Hudson points out, it didn't serve the king to have all these people in debtor's prison. The king wanted people out there working the fields. And you could use usury, you could use interest as a sort of a way to keep people in line. You know, the money system was really a way of controlling the people. But if you want to keep them working, you've got to let them out of prison, forgive the debts and let them out. But the reason they were able to do that was that the debts were owed to the king. So then what I was writing about specifically in this article was that, and as our interviewee will be talking about today, we've got this trade war going on that supposedly the war is about the fact that China is cutting corners or doing things that our businesses don't get to do, and therefore they are coming out ahead. Among those are that their government supports their businesses and their government owns the banks, which then doesn't put the companies into bankruptcy when they're bankrupt, but just carries the debt, particularly if they're state-owned banks, just carries them on the books, rather like the Federal Reserve did with QE1 when they bought toxic mortgage-backed securities off the books of the banks and let the banks carry on. So anyway, the criticism is that they're cheating because they have all these unfair advantages. But what I was suggesting was that you actually need this form of debt jubilee. You need to write off the debts. And so why don't we do like they're doing and give our companies those advantages as well? Like the government could be supporting those industries that are particularly important to our economy. And it's really Wall Street that has bled our companies dry. It's really Wall Street that sold those whatever patents, et cetera, to China. So from my point of view, the Chinese are just opportunists. We opened up to them and they took it. And then what Ian Fletcher will be saying is that we need to impose tariffs in order to level the playing field. And you know, he's definitely got a good point there. But the other possibility is to do what they're doing.
Right, and he points out that the recent shift in the corporate heads thinking the bottom line needs to be changed from stockholder profits and to looking at the responsibility of corporations to their communities, their employers, and to the rest of the world. So you see change in the priorities that have been set for corporate America. It'll be interesting to see whether or not they could ever make the transition from profiteering in every which way they can to being able to get their companies to serve their employers, their neighborhoods, and the country as a whole.
Yeah, they're not going to do it just because somebody lectures them and says they should do it. I mean, there's going to have to be some sort of change in the law. But so my argument was that we can't duplicate a debt jubilee now of the sort that the Sumerians and Babylonians and Assyrians did because the government no longer is the lender. But the government could be the lender. I mean, so one possibility would be to nationalize the banks, and then we could write off those.
But public policies like the student debt issue, the medical debt issue, you've written about this before, that the Fed could just simply put that on our balance sheet eliminate that and dramatically improve our economic standing.
Yes, you don't have to hurt the creditors. I mean, not some of these creditors,
Right.
I wouldn't mind if they felt a little pinch, but they will complain, and they do have their legal rights and so forth. So you could still do a debt jubilee and allow the creditors to get paid, but it would be paid by the Federal Reserve. And of course, my preference, or what I think is the most equitable, is a national dividend that you give the same amount to everyone, even the rich people, because there really aren't that many 0.1 percenters. And then if they are debtors, 80% of the population is carrying debt. So that could go directly into their bank accounts. And so the bank knows if you've got debt, so it would go right in to pay off your debts. And if you liquidate debt, then that money goes to zero. So you're not actually inflating the money supply. The objection is going to be that it will inflate the money supply, but it won't, because if 80% of it goes to pay off debt, that money is just going to go to zero, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Like money is created as a loan, and it's extinguished when the loan is paid off. So if you pay off debt, you're going to extinguish the same amount of money you just put into the system.
Yeah. The reality of our economy is increasing number of people are suffering, working harder for less, unable to meet their bills. They needed a debt jubilee. So we're starting to see, at least on the Democratic presidential stage, several different ideas about how that virtual debt forgiveness could occur, including the UBIT thing, the Yang's business about $1,000 a month. Many approaches. Money is front and center for everybody in our country and perhaps in the world. So I'm glad that we're in this discussion, Ellen. I'm glad we're having a chance to put in our 2 cents worth and putting in multiples of that.
I like to see both sides, and we, of course, try not to take a political position, but these are all issues that everybody's facing right now, so it's good to have information from all sides on it.
All right. Well, thanks, Ellen, and let's go listen to your conversation with Ian Fletcher.
Okay. Free trade and tariffs are a hot topic right now, since President Trump is being tough with tariffs, particularly on China. So it's my pleasure to be speaking with one of America's foremost experts on that topic. Ian Fletcher was formerly senior economist for the Coalition for a Prosperous America and is the author of the 2011 book, Free Trade Doesn't Work. It's great to be talking with you, Ian.
It's great to be here, Ellen.
You're obviously opposed to free trade, but that's a bit confusing to many people. We're a free country. We believe in freedom. It seems like free trade must be a good thing. So it seems like the best place to start might be with some definitions. What do you mean by free trade, and what is it about that policy that doesn't work?
Well, free trade basically means that you can bring in goods from abroad without any tariffs or quotas or other restrictions on doing so. And I agree with you that given that America is a free country, that it certainly sounds like a good thing at first blush. However, you discover when you look into it, like a lot of things, free trade, free love, whatever, what sounds good and what actually works out as being a good thing for the country are not necessarily the same thing. Let me clarify at the outset that I'm not against trade. I support trade, but trade and free trade are very different things. And this has actually been recognized for centuries. It's a little-known fact that a lot of people would like to cover up, that all of the founding fathers pretty much were protectionists. Even the ones that weren't to start with, like Thomas Jefferson, came around in the end. And the United States was, for most of its history, a tariff-protected economy. And I would remind people that it was under tariffs that the U.S. went from being an agricultural backwater on the fringes of civilization to being the greatest economic power the world had ever seen.
Mm-hmm. And you've argued that imposing free trade on developing countries actually increases inequalities. So can you explain why that would be?
That's true, though it's not usually my main personal focus at the Coalition for a Prosperous America, which, by the way, folks can find at prosperousamerica.org. I've been mainly concerned with the United States, but it is true that free trade is a terrible policy for most developing countries because what happens is it tends to just trap them producing raw materials and agricultural products. And if your economy is organized around producing and selling coffee, you're not going to industrialize, you're not going to develop, you're going to be stuck as a nation of peasant farmers basically forever. If you look at formerly poor countries that have since developed and become rich, countries like Japan or Korea, and people forget sometimes just how poor these countries were in living memory, they used protectionism and a lot of other policies to develop and industrialize and become the modern successful countries that they are today.
Right. Yeah, I read Ha-Jin Chang's book. He's Korean, and he said, just what you said, that they heavily protected their industries. And if you didn't, like you're a small industry and you're trying to compete with an established country, or even if you take something like corn in Latin America, we managed to beat out their homegrown corn business because we can produce it and ship it more cheaply than they can grow it. So, yeah, I totally agree with that, and that, good point. You've also written about the negative effects of a massive trade deficit. I mean, some people say it's good that we have a trade deficit. It just means that other countries are funding our debt, but you disagree with that. So can you explain that?
Sure. People who think that the trade deficit is not a problem are basically naively telling us that when foreign countries buy our debt, that they're playing Santa Claus and that we're getting this money for nothing. Now, I have to ask, do you really think our foreign counterparties are stupid? The answer is when foreign countries buy our debt, they're buying it because then it's an asset which they own and we owe, and it makes them wealthier and us poorer. There is no free lunch in this world. That's really all you need to know to understand that the trade deficit is a negative indicator of the success of our economy and a bad thing.
I'll leave it at that. And you have said currency manipulation doesn't work and floating exchange rates don't help. Those are pretty abstruse concepts for a lot of people, but I don't know if you can do it in a nutshell, but can you say why those aren't working? I know we're always complaining that China's manipulating their currency, and then they let it be unmanipulated for one day, and the market crashed because they were manipulating their currency up to make it stronger. They're not making it weaker to compete with our businesses. They were actually trying to make it stronger. So anyway, just say a few words on that, even though maybe it's too complicated to you.
There are a lot of spaghetti tangles of this question, but the underlying facts are pretty basic. Currency is money, and when you look at the trade balance between different countries, that is the difference between what we buy from them as opposed to what they buy from us, the relative prices of the currencies, in this particular case the dollar and the renminbi, are a big factor in determining whether trade is going to be balanced or whether the U.S. is going to be running a trade deficit or a surplus. And what currency manipulation is when foreign governments have figured this out and they've realized that by artificially depressing the value of their currencies, they can get more exports to the United States. And this sort of thing has been going on for decades, though the countries doing it changes over time. I mean, depending on how you define it, which, as you said, can get complicated. Germany, Korea, Japan, China, all sorts of countries have been in on this game. Now, you mentioned floating exchange rates as something that doesn't work. Floating exchange rates is the idea that if you just let the relative prices of currencies float and be determined by currency traders on Wall Street and London and so on and so forth, that, like other free market policies, this is going to give you the best result. Well, I certainly wish that were true, but the fact is that in a world where governments know they can manipulate currencies to gain advantage, Too much of world trade is conducted in currencies that simply are not floating currencies. They're manipulated currencies. And even when currencies are not deliberately manipulated, there are a whole host of other factors that can cause currencies to be too rich or too poor for extended periods of time. And when the dollar is too rich, that means the U.S. imports too much, and it also means that U.S. exports are uncompetitive. So it helps to bring about the deindustrialization of the United States.
Well, and I would be more worried about private investors manipulating the currencies like they did with the Asian crisis of 1997-98, and George Soros apparently trashed the British pound just to prove that he could do it. And I guess that's what happened to Greece in 2010. There were a bunch of investors got together and decided to short sell all at once and brought down the Greek currency. So I agree that there's something very wrong about floating exchange rates, but I don't see exactly how you would fix them either, because you're going to get out of step somehow. Like if you say whatever $10, a pound of corn is worth X amount of money, at some point it's not worth that. I mean, how do you fix it? What do you fix it against in order to make it? What would you do?
Well, basically what you're saying is that you can't manipulate exchange rates arbitrarily and just say a certain currency is going to be worth a certain amount of another currency just because we say so. It's absolutely true that that would fail. That is not to say, however, that governments don't have the power, which they observably do, to push their currencies up or down by 20, 25%. That happens all the time. In terms of what I would do to fix this, I'm in favor of bringing back taxes on international movements of capital, which would basically make this kind of thing not impossible, but would make it too expensive for anyone to want to do it. There's a proposal in the Senate that Coalition for Prosperous America helped to create called the Baldwin-Hawley bill, which establishes something called a market access charge. The details are detailed. If anyone wants to Google it, look it up, you can. But the basic idea is you apply a tax to international movements of capital. And when you do that, the forces which manipulate currencies deliberately or push them out of alignment with the value that would result in balanced trade, they're taxed. So it's too expensive for this kind of thing to happen, and that's how you would put an end to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm in favor of a financial transactions tax in general, but that's interesting. I'll look that up. Sorry, say the name of the bill again.
It's called the Baldwin-Hawley bill, Baldwinhawley. It's in the Senate.
Yeah. And you've also discussed how we used to be a protectionist country, and then right up until the mid-20th century somewhere, and then we changed policies. And I guess you were curious yourself why we changed policies or what brought that about. So that was pretty interesting. Do you want to go into that?
Sure. All of the founding fathers were or became protectionists. Every president on Mount Rushmore was a protectionist. All the presidents on our paper currency were protectionists. That is American history. A lot of libertarians and whatnot want to airbrush that out of the picture, but it's pretty undeniable once you look into it. And protectionism was a standard part of the understood economic policy toolkit for most of the 19th century, which is why the U.S. did it, and the U.S. succeeded at it very well. It was Abraham Lincoln's number 2 issue after the Civil War, for example. So, as you mentioned, I was curious myself as to why this ended when I wrote my book, Free Trade Doesn't Work, which folks can find at freetradedoesn'twork.com. So I wondered, why did we as a country change our mind? Because we did. We're a free trading nation now until very recently under President Trump. It turns out, when you look into it, that there was no intellectual revelation where the U.S. suddenly discovered that protectionism, contrary to what we had believed, was bad, and that free trade, contrary to what we had believed, was good. What happened is that after World War II, when the Cold War started up, we threw our markets open to the rest of the world as a bribe for these other countries to not go communist and to help prop up their economies. Just to give you one example, Italy in the 40s and 50s was a relatively poor country. There was hope that it was developing, but there was a significant communist threat because Italy had a big communist party. The United States opened its markets to exports of Italian leather shoes to the U.S. Now, when we do that, not only does that help to industrialize Italy, raise wages, and push Marxism to the back burner, which of course is what eventually happened, but it also gave us leverage over the Italian government of, if you get too friendly with the Soviet Union, we can cut off your shoe exports and then you'll have 20% unemployment in some of your industrial cities, and that'll be a real problem for you. And this is, of course, replicated all over the world, the Far East, other countries in Europe, so on and so forth. So that was a rational political strategy at the time, and probably the correct choice. It doesn't mean that free trade as a blanket policy, which it later became, is a good idea.
And you pointed out that it really serves the big corporations, which are multinational. They don't have any sort of national allegiance, and they own the news media, so they make us think that everyone thinks it's a good idea, when really we, the little people, are not being served by it. But I do wonder about, I mean, you see, so we've basically given away the farm somewhere in the last 50 or so years, but now President Trump is trying to reverse all that, and you do hear a lot of pushback that businesses, are having to pay more for parts that they get abroad, and there's a concern that poor people have to pay more at Walmart, that sort of thing. So it's one thing to say, well, we made a mistake, we should have done it the other way, but how do we fix it in a way that's relatively painless? And do you think the president, without getting too political, we try not to get political, but do you think it's working or it's a good ploy what the president's doing now?
Well, you mentioned companies having difficulty getting parts. You mentioned poor people being faced with huge price increases at Walmart. That is not real. If we were looking at that, we would have seen an uptick in the inflation numbers in this country, and that simply hasn't happened. Those stories are basically invented by the kind of multinational corporate interests you identified a minute ago as not being interested in the economic welfare of this country and its citizens and having a vested interest in free trade. In terms of how the president is doing, I would have to say that in complete honesty, it didn't take us 2-3 years to get into the mess we're in, and it's not going to take 2 or 3 years to get out of it. So it's kind of too early to judge the overall success of Trump's trade policies. I can say I'm very, very glad that the United States has finally responded to the ongoing trade war against us, which has been happening for decades. People talk about Trump started a trade war. No, countries like China started a trade war. We finally started shooting back. And it's going to be a lot less disruptive to solve this problem now than if we had allowed things to worsen for another 10 years and only gotten serious about the problem 10 years from now. So on trade, and I am not an across-the-board Trump supporter, and I have nothing to say about other aspects of the administration, but on trade, I think what Trump is doing is infinitely better than what any U.S. president has done in many, many decades.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's good to know since we're there. So you say we gave away the farm for political reasons, but I've also I saw a very good article in the American Conservative called "America's Monopoly Crisis Hits the Military," where they were blaming it's the financialization of the economy. It's Wall Street. So they were basically saying that China didn't steal our technology. It was Wall Street that sold it to them. So I just have a few quotes here that I thought I would read and get your get your opinion. To me, that's the really interesting part, how we got all financialized. Why is it that profits are sucking the life out of our businesses instead of the money going to workers and going into productivity? It's going into profits for shareholders and investors. So anyway, I'll just read a few paragraphs. They write, and this is particularly concerning military secrets, which is not just a matter of economics, but could actually be our military security. It wasn't one of our adversaries that killed our telecommunications capacity. This is talking about Huawei. But one of our own institutions, Wall Street, and its pressure on executives to make decisions designed to impress financial markets rather than for the long-term health of their companies. Financial pressure led to a change in focus for many in the defense industry, from technological engineering to balance sheet engineering. Instead of innovating new technology to support our national security, they innovate new ways of creating monopolies to take advantage of it. Because of public policies focused on finance instead of production, the United States increasingly cannot produce or maintain vital systems upon which our economy, our military, and our allies rely. Huawei is just a particularly prominent example. So I wonder what your comments are on that. How did we get into this mess? Well, I mean, I have my own ideas, which I'll say. What do you think about that?
Wall Street and China are both very bad actors, and it is not helpful to say that the one doesn't count because of the other. It's like if you have two holes in the boat. You say, oh, this hole doesn't count because look at that hole over there. Well, no, they both count. And both of them need to be brought under kind of discipline. There's related issues, because if you change the behavior of Wall Street, then you make short-term profits at the expense of long-term health of companies less attractive, which means you make expedients like outsourcing production to China, which then steals your technology and in the end eats your business, less attractive. I note with great interest that the Business Roundtable a couple of weeks ago, which is an organization of Fortune 500 CEOs, formally changed a statement of business purpose that they had had on their books for, I think, about 20 years now, where they used to say that the sole purpose of a business is to make profits for its shareholders. And they have gone back to what they used to say back in the day, which is businesses have multiple obligations to their shareholders, their debt holders, to their employers, to their suppliers, to the communities, and to the country at large, which is the way American capitalism historically was run. And this idea of running a business only for the benefit of shareholders, which is kind of a code word of short-term profits at the expense of everything else, including long-term survival, that is an aberration and a mistake. And the clearest example of this, if you look at companies, is what happened to General Electric. General Electric was, of course, one of America's most successful companies, going back decades to its founding by Thomas Edison. Then for about 20 years, it was, under Jack Welch and his successors, increasingly run as just a short-term cash cow. And this is when they got to the point where something like over a third of their profits simply came from their financial arm, GE Capital, as opposed to the parts of the company that actually made light bulbs and power generation turbines and everything else. Yeah. And GE had a lot of profits for a few years, and since then they have absolutely slumped into a crisis, and the company is a mess. And that's what happens when you take even the very strong company and allow it to be run for the purposes of short-term profits. But people, not just ordinary folk, but people in positions of high corporate authority, are starting to wake up to this problem, and the revised statement of corporate purpose by the Business Roundtable is a good example of that.
Yeah, that's good, very good. It seems to me you also pointed out that it was laughable, the idea that we could get China to conform to our rules, because, first of all, they're probably not going to do it, even say they'll do it, but even if they agree to it, we can't police them because they're way over there. And so it seems to me a better tack would be some of what they do is actually better. This is what I write about, is actually better than what we do. That we should have public banks. We should be subsidizing our important industries, and we should be writing off debt instead of just putting companies into bankruptcy and banks into bankruptcy when they can't meet these certain technical requirements. So, of course, my thing is all public banking. We should turn banking into a public utility and direct it toward what the economy needs and what the people need, support wage earners, support businesses, that kind of thing. So what do you think about that?
I support public banking as one part of a healthy banking system. I would, however, caution you that China's economy is so different than ours that looking at public banks over there as a model for what we should do here is not especially relevant. As you know, there are models of public banking in the United States that we can turn to within our own economy.
They do. I forget what it was. They said it was something with Chinese characteristics. Well, we need to do it with American characteristics. I totally agree. We just need to adapt. I mean, it would have to be doing it our way. But still, there's a lot to be said for actually supporting some industries. For example, I think the military should really be a public, right now it's public-private, so the private's bleeding the military dry, and we, the public, are paying for it. But they really are a socialist institution. I mean, we're supporting these soldiers pretty much cradle to grave. So we've allowed these private companies to monopolize certain important sectors or certain important, like maybe one little piece of an engine that we can't do without, and then they can drive the prices way, way up. Well, that should be socialized or nationalized or whatever you say. It should be turned into a public utility. Likewise, I would say with medical things that we're forcing people to have insurance, and then we allow companies to charge whatever the market will bear. I think that should all be socialized in some way.
Returning to your earlier point about it not being possible for us to get China to play by our rules, I think that is the case. I think that China and the United States have very, very different economic civilizations, so to speak. China is based on state capitalism rather than private capitalism, and the Chinese couldn't change their system to become harmless to our economy, even if they wanted to, without wholesale giving up their entire way of doing things, which they are in no mood to do because, among other things, it's the basis for the power of the Chinese Communist Party. As a result, I think that the current negotiations with China are doomed. I think that Robert Lighthizer, who is Trump's United States trade representative, knows that they're doomed. I think we are going through with these negotiations in order to be able to tell people, look, folks, we tried. But I believe the ultimate outcome is going to be an economic divorce between the United States and China. And this will be a good thing. Our systems are different, and there do need to be meaningful barriers of separation between them. It doesn't mean there will be no trade, but it does mean, for example, that we can't allow companies like Huawei to use government subsidies to outcompete and destroy American manufacturers of telecommunications equipment, which is extremely important for the security implications and many other things.
Yeah, no, that would be an interesting experiment if we can weather it. If we can do without each other. Ultimately, I agree that countries should have the right to set up whatever system they want, and then we should have little experiments all over the world that are trying out different systems, and we can see what works and choose the best. But it is difficult figuring out all the details for all that. So your ultimate solution, I guess, then would be to impose a tariff across the board, right? Just a flat tariff of a certain percentage, which would be sort of equivalent to a tax. You're like taxing foreigners who otherwise aren't paying the same income taxes that we're paying, something like that. Is that correct, or what's your proposed solution?
Well, what I put in my book, Free Trade Doesn't Work, was a flat tariff, and that could be anything between 10 and 30%. And the reason to have a flat tariff is you avoid the political mischief of having a different tariff on different products. And it's also the case, for reasons explained in my book, that a flat tariff on an economy that's anything but flat will tend to have the right differential impact on different industries that we would want it to have. It will tend to protect the industries you would want to protect, and will tend to give less protection to industries you would want to have less protection. The experience of unfolding historic events since my book came out in 2011 would lead me to say that there are going to be a little more complexities on that, particularly because we are dealing with different national governments, and we do have a trade problem with countries like Germany and Japan, but it's not the same as the trade problem we have with China, so it's not appropriate to have the same tariff on every country. I would, however, definitely agree that we want to keep things as simple as possible.
Yeah, I agree too. That the simpler, the less possibility of political manipulation and the less arguing. That's one reason I support a universal basic income, or I would call it a national dividend. We need extra money in our local economies. There are two economies. I think there's the speculative economy, and then there's the local productive economy. And the local productive economy is short of money. It needs extra money. And the fairest way to get it out there is just give everybody the same amount. You don't have to apply for it. You don't have to show that you deserve it. You don't have to make exceptions. Just everyone gets the same amount. It could all be done by algorithm automatically. Anyway, yep, I agree with that. So is there more you'd like to add?
The number one thing I would ask people to understand is that the United States doesn't have a choice with what it's doing right now, Trump's trade war, whatever you want to call it. This problem has been building up for decades, and it was going to be forced at some point. We were going to have to deal with it by hook or by crook. So I'm very glad that this administration is at least doing something. Their responses are not perfect. They're not exactly what I would do. But I still think we're vastly better off than we would be if we had continued to drift along in a fantasy world of free trade when free trade isn't even really free. It's grossly manipulated by a lot of foreign countries, and they take advantage of American naivete in supporting this academic chalkboard concept of free trade that doesn't correspond to reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great to hear because, I mean, we're here, so it's good to know that we're on the right track. Tell our listeners where to find your work and so forth.
Sure. If you want to look for my work, my website for my book is at freetradedoesn'twork.com. I'm on the advisory board of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, which you can find at prosperousamerica.org. You can also buy my book on Amazon.com.
So it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your insights on all this interesting topic.
You're very welcome. You have a great show.
Okay, thank you. I've been speaking with Ian Fletcher, author of Free Trade Doesn't Work, available at freetradedoesn'twork.com.
This year, we're celebrating the centennial anniversary of the Bank of North Dakota, our guiding light on the prairie for public banking in America. We've been talking with Mike Jacobs, who is the bank's official historian for the retrospective, which includes his excellent book, with great pictures, by the way, called The Bank of North Dakota, From Surviving to Thriving, the First 100 Years. As we talk about the remarkable and consistent success that bank has demonstrated with its year-over-year record-breaking profitability, we're often told that it's only because of the oil that North Dakota has been producing in recent years. So we thought we'd ask Mike about what the relationship between the bank and the oil industry is, and how that affects bank profitability.
To my knowledge, there were no direct investments in oil development, and I'm not aware even now of any direct investment in the production part of the oil boom. The state is very much involved, of course, in local infrastructure loans and local business loans. trucking, a secondary business like a trucking business might appeal to the local bank for a loan, and the local bank might involve the Bank of North Dakota through one of its business lending programs. But it would be unlikely that Continental Oil, for example, would approach the Bank of North Dakota for a loan. And the day of the individual oil speculators is pretty much past. Oil speculation now is more, well, I shouldn't even say now, but in the run-up to the boom, the individual oil entrepreneur was out trying to secure leases on mineral acres that he or she could then sell to a production company.
But profits from the oil part of North Dakota's land flowed into the bank. But
yes. Yes, initially, certainly so. This is a fascinating and complex system that the state has set up. Essentially what happens is that the state has created a series of funds earmarked for various things that revenue from the state lands and oil development, it's kind of like a water wheel. The money comes in at the top and it flows into one bucket, and when that bucket gets full, it spills into the next, and so on. And when all of the buckets get full, the rest of it spills into the state's general fund. So the oil tax money is not going directly at this point into the bank, but the bank has investments that are paying dividends into the bank through a wide variety of developments going on around the state. You look at the bank's activities today. This morning they would have published the exchange rate that they were offering on Canadian currency, for example, which is a traditional banking function. There are stories about various loan buy-downs that are happening around the state. They are, as the state's repository, of course, they have all of this money that they are able to invest in what's now, we love picturesque ruralisms in North Dakota. The Prairie Dog Fund. Prairie dogs are colonial community creatures, and so the Prairie Dog Fund is a way for the state to distribute oil revenues around the state, even into non-oil producing counties, so that towns distant from the oil fields it's a way of distributing the wealth across the state. And that's done through various community development programs that the bank has a role in because it's the state's depository. So, it's a money changer.
So the legislature presumably created these funds on some level. The bank is the administrator for the cash flow. Is that how it
Yeah, well, the money that is tied directly to the state's land and the state's mineral acres is administered by the State Land Board. There was a consequential scandal, considerable scandal, we'll see whether or not it was consequential, in the legislature because the state treasurer failed to move $262 million from the oil tax revenues into the Common Schools Trust Fund over the last decade, and consequently the Common Schools Trust Fund, which is a relic of statehood. It was established through the state school lands that were reserved at statehood. This is common to all of the Great Plains states. The money was not transferred, and so the school trust fund was shorted, and then that had to be made up. So money is now being transferred from other funds back to the school trust fund in order to make that whole. The consequence for the bank is that because the 2015 and 17 sessions took place in times of very severe contraction in the oil business, the bank's profits were tapped to replace the money that was not flowing into these funds. So the bank in this case sort of stood as a bulwark against that kind of potentially very damaging, there's no other word for it other than accounting error, a $262 million accounting error. So that's another way in which the bank, even though the money isn't flowing directly into the bank is still there as a bulwark to protect those funds. It has the elements of a commercial bank. It has the elements of a central bank. It has the elements of a Fort Knox, where you put the public money. It's sort of the standard for banking and finance, state finance.
Yeah, it's a remarkable bulwark, as you said, and I want to refer to the annual report that indicates that now for the 15th consecutive year, record profits at the bank, $159 million in net earnings. with a return on equity of 18%, which is remarkable, among the best, if not the best in the country.
Probably, yeah.
And that is a range that has been going on for about 12, 13, 14 years. Return on equity, a sign of the profitability of an institution, between 17 and 26% for all of this time. It's a remarkable record. And as the rest of the world likes to say, well, it's because of your oil. It's because North Dakota has oil. And yet what you're saying here is that the oil has been an inconsistent partner, and it's also not necessarily the driver of that profitability.
And oil is a mixed blessing because oil is an extremely volatile market. And the other issue with oil, of course, is that the more unsettled the world is, the higher the oil price. So we've been seeing oil prices trending upward as tensions in the Middle East ratchet up. Just last week, I think the price of oil was up 1.5%, 2% in a week, just in reaction to the uncertainty surrounding the Gulf region. So now we're back at oil in the low 62.5 roughly. But that's the sort of rule of thumb in North Dakota is if you can keep the price of oil above $60, we're rich. When it starts to go below 50 and heads down toward $40, then we start getting worried. And of course, that's what happened in late 2014, was it? Early 2015, when the world oil market really literally plunged from $100 a barrel to less than half that. So it remains a volatile business. At the moment, the price of oil is trending upward. And so but the bank was not tapped this year at the legislature for money to make up any of the shortfalls in other funds other than this mistake. So what I'm saying is that all of the state's investments are doing very well, except for this one accounting error, the one accounting error that's been found. When you're dealing with those kinds of figures, you always run the risk of a decimal point being misplaced somewhere. The problem here was a conflicting interpretation of how the money should be handled.
So there you see that the Bank of North Dakota's role in the state economy does what most public banks around the world do: stabilize the local economy through thick and thin, and provide a backdrop of flexibility and resources for fiscal problem-solving of many types. Next time we'll talk with Mike about how the bureaucratic administration of the bank comes into play, and how they've managed to avoid corruption and collusion. Let us recommend to you Mike Jacobs' excellent centennial retrospective book on the Bank of North Dakota by visiting the bank's anniversary website at bnd.nd.gov or through local booksellers or Amazon.com. Our thanks to Mike Jacobs and the Bank of North Dakota for providing these interviews. Well, that's it for this edition of It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. Our thanks to our guests, our sponsor, Public Banking Associates, and to you for listening. Be sure to check out Ellen's latest writings on the economy and the changing world of money by visiting ellenbrown.com. And for more information on public banking, visit publicbankinginstitute.org. For information on how local and state government leaders can obtain professional insight and counsel about public banks from key national experts, visit publicbankingassociates.com. I'm Walt McCree. See you next time on It's Our Money with Ellen Brown.